Welcome to this online lesson on Vietnamization, 1969 to 1975. Why did Nixon succeed in pulling the US out of Vietnam but fail to win the war? The aims are to know the later events of the Vietnam War, to explain why the USA expanded the war, and to assess the extent to which Nixon's Vietnamization policy failed. The do now task is this. In 1969, President Johnson was replaced by Republican President Richard M. Nixon. There he is in the picture. Have you heard of Nixon? What might he be most famous for? Jot down some ideas, press pause, and then when you're ready, just press play and we'll continue. Alright, I expect many of you have heard of President Nixon before. The fact is he's most famous for the Watergate scandal, in which he had knowledge of Republican Party officials breaking into the Watergate building of the Democratic headquarters and stealing documents. This was of course highly illegal as well as highly immoral. The fact that Nixon failed to recognise that he did know about this was really what brought his downfall. He had lied to the public, he had lied to them on live TV, and he was facing an impeachment. And it is very likely that that impeachment would have succeeded, unlike the more recent one against Donald Trump. So Nixon is perhaps most famous for saying that he wasn't a crook, despite the fact that he proved in the end that he sort of was. However, we're not going to be concentrating on that today. We're going to be looking at his Vietnam policy. And this was a large part of his presidential campaign, and probably one of the biggest reasons why he ended up winning that election. Let's move on. Let's look at some key terms related to the Vietnamization policy. In close compendium of annoying old-fashioned words that you need to know today are Vietnamization. This is a term used to describe the process of giving more defence responsibility to the government of South Vietnam. Secondly, doctrine, a way of doing things usually relating to politics. And now your tasks. Record the key terms and their meanings. And then, Vietnamization was Nixon's big idea as president. Why does this mean it is sometimes called the Nixon doctrine? Pause the video here and complete the tasks. Ready to move on? Alright, well, the Nixon doctrine of Vietnamization is usually referred to in that way because a doctrine is a way of doing things, usually relating to politics, and Vietnamization was the way that Nixon wanted to handle the situation in Vietnam. But let's have a look at what the effects of that actually were. Have a look at this table of statistics first of all. ARVN, remember, or ARVN, is the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. This is the South Vietnamese Army. We've also got the US Army, and we've got the losses for each side. Here we've got two sections, 1969 and 1970. Notice that the number of ARVN troops between 1969 and 1970 increases. Equally, the US troops in 1969 then declines by 1970. Notice the number of ARVN deaths also decreases in 1970, despite the fact that there were more of them. But more notably, notice by how much the US deaths decreases by 1970. Vietnamization was the gradual process of letting ARVN take over defence of Vietnam. Nixon insisted that this was done as follows. Firstly, that US troops were to withdraw. That ARVN was supposed to provide its own leaders to continue the war. And that the US was to continue its commitment to providing training and equipment for ARVN. Crucially, and this was probably the most difficult part to achieve, the US withdrawal was not to be done immediately, but to be done with honour, not abandoning the South Vietnam to the mercy of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army. South Vietnam was to remain a separate part of Vietnam, separate from the North, and that it would not become communist. That was a key condition, otherwise US involvement in Vietnam had sort of been for nothing. Here are your tasks. Consider these bullet points. Choose one bullet point and back it up with statistics from the table. If you could do that for more than one bullet point, it would be even better. Part 2. Consider previous lessons or previous learning that you might have on the topic of the Vietnam War. Why might Nixon have felt pressure to bring US troops home? Thirdly, and as a challenge, why might it be difficult for the US to withdraw with honour? Pause the video now, and when you're ready, press play to continue. Well, what answers did you come up with? Well, if we're considering our previous learning, why might Nixon have felt pressure to bring US troops home? Remember, US troop numbers have been steadily increasing throughout the period of the 1960s, and therefore the number of deaths had been increasing too. The war was becoming less and less popular. Also, he had won his election campaign on a promise to end the Vietnam War. If he didn't deliver on this, then his election campaign would be seen as a pack of lies. Thirdly, in the challenge section, why might it be difficult? Well, it was widely accepted that ARVN were not effective as a fighting force in the same way that the American army was. So, if the US army was to be replaced by ARVN soldiers, it would not really be a question of replacing like for like. ARVN soldiers were usually more hastily trained and not as well equipped as American soldiers, despite the billions of dollars of American aid that have been flooding into Vietnam for several years. So it might be difficult for American soldiers to simply withdraw and expect ARVN to perform the same role. Here are some reactions to Vietnamization. First, a reaction by a North Vietnamese general. I should point out that these are ideas rather than actual quotes. Vietnamization is good news. ARVN soldiers are easier to beat. Here's a reaction of a US general. That's US General Westmoreland pictured there, but this is not actually a quote by him, but it very much reflects his ideas. We need to send more troops. Vietnamization isn't working as the ARVN can't cope on their own. Now the view of a South Vietnamese politician. The USA are deserting us. They know that we need their help. Remember, the South Vietnamese political system was often seen as very corrupt, and it was distrusted by their own people and very unpopular. Finally, the view of an American citizen and civilian. We've done our bit, now bring our boys home now. War weariness by this point was setting in. Remember that after the Tet Offensive, many Americans who had believed that the war would be won quickly had realised that actually the war could not be won easily, if at all. Your tasks. Explain why each of the people holds this view of Vietnamization. As an extension, relate their view to a specific example from earlier lessons or other parts of your learning of the Vietnam War. Secondly, do you agree with the view of the US general and the South Vietnamese politician that the ARVN couldn't cope on its own? Use point, example, explain to back up your answer. Thirdly, as a challenge, whose opinion would Nixon be most worried about? With that one there, there's no definite right answer, but it gets you thinking about what the motivations of politicians are over generals in the army. Pause the video now and complete the tasks. Press play when you're ready. Alright, let's see what ideas you've come up with. Firstly, the NVA general would likely hold that point of view because he had seen in earlier experience in battles that ARVN were not as effective soldiers as their US counterparts. An example of this might be the battle during the Tet Offensive, in which ARVN relied really on American support in order to beat the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese attacks, although it was widely seen that ARVN had done quite well during that operation. US generals like Westmoreland focused on things like the body count, how many enemies they were killing. If they thought that they had more soldiers, then the body count would go up and they'd be more likely to win. Whether this is a particularly accurate view is another matter. As for the South Vietnamese politicians, well, remember that they were very much distrusted by their own people, and they saw people going to the Viet Cong and fighting against their government constantly throughout the 1960s. Not only that, they may well have been conscious of what happened in the end to Diem in 1963 when he was assassinated, possibly with CIA approval. Their position was very precarious, and so they did not want to be deserted. And lastly, the US citizen. Remember that opposition to the war had been growing throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s as more and more young Americans were sent and more came back, sadly, dead and in body bags. Do you agree with the view of the US general and the South Vietnamese politician that ARVN couldn't cope on their own? Well, the chances are that you probably do agree with that point of view, as ARVN on their own had previously shown that they were not able to defeat the forces of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese soldiers on their own. Consider the early battle of Ap Bac, in which ARVN had suffered disastrous losses in return for inflicting very limited damage upon the Viet Cong people that they were fighting. And lastly, whose opinion would Nixon be most worried about? Well, probably all of them. But the only one that he had real influence on was the US citizens. After all, as a politician, he had been elected by them, and so ultimately he was answerable to them. The US general, on the other hand, effectively worked for the president. South Vietnamese politicians would probably have seen themselves as relying on the US president as well. And as for the North Vietnamese general, well, there was nothing Nixon could do about him, so probably he was lowest down on his list of worries. Now, as Nixon had promised to finish the war, he surprised quite a lot of people by expanding the war. The picture shows the iconic American B-52 bomber involved in what was called Operation Linebacker 1. This was followed up by another Linebacker operation later on in 1972. We'll come to what that involved shortly. Nixon won the 1969 election by promising to bring an end to US involvement in Vietnam, but for a time he actually expanded it. Firstly, with the invasion of Cambodia in 1970. Cambodia had been taken over by a communist government called the Khmer Rouge, and it was worried that this was part of domino theory. North Vietnam was communist, Cambodia was now communist. What next? ARVN troops invaded Cambodia with American approval to try and combat the spread of communism. Also, the invasion of Laos under similar circumstances in 1971. Remember, Laos had been a key route for supplying the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese armies fighting in South Vietnam via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And lastly, the Easter Offensive of 1972. This was an all-out, full-scale offensive launched by the North Vietnamese army against South Vietnam. This is not an example of guerrilla warfare. This is all-out offensive warfare with tanks and planes, you name it. This led to unrestricted bombing of North Vietnam. Whereas the earlier Operation Rolling Thunder had been very much hamstrung by the fact that Washington had to approve different targets at different times and the job really couldn't get done, Operation Linebacker left very few things off the target list. Linebacker 1 was followed by Linebacker 2 and did include targets as significant as the capital of Hanoi in North Vietnam. So, your tasks. For this one, I'm going to rely on you to do a bit more of your own research. Firstly, create a timeline of events from 1970 to 1973. A decent scale for this would be 7 centimetres equals 1 year, which should give you plenty of space to write events around the timeline. Then, once you've drawn your timeline, add these events to your timeline. The invasion of Cambodia, the invasion of Laos, and the Easter Offensive, and finally, the bombing of Vietnam in Operation Linebacker 1 and 2. Secondly, read the information in the links provided in the description. Each one will probably take you about 10 minutes to read. You'll want to then, 3, add a description of each event above your timeline, and then 4, under your timeline, explain what the outcomes were. Did the events bring the war closer to ending? Aim to get about 3 really good examples for each of the key events. Remember, in the exam there will be few questions where you will need more than 3 examples per specific event, so that should give you plenty of notes to revise from. This will be quite time consuming, so I'll expect that you'll need to pause the video now and spend a good half an hour at least on that. Alright, are we ready to continue? Just make sure that you've got enough examples around your timeline before we do. If you need to go back and revisit some of the links, then please do so. Definitely sure? Then let's move on. Why did Vietnamization fail? This is going to be a bit of practice in producing a mind map. You may want to make your own based upon the information on this slide as a way of revising it. It will also produce a pretty comprehensive display as to why Vietnamization was not in the end an effective policy. This could be as simple as simply copying down the notes that I make here, or you could make your own categories, you could illustrate them with pictures, or you could colour code them even further. For now then, I'll simply read the information to you. Firstly, there were the effects on the US Army itself. As morale declined, morale meaning happiness among the soldiers, drug use increased. There were a massive 35,000 heroin addicts in the US Army in 1971. Those are not going to be effective soldiers, and that's going to cause them very much long-term difficulties as well. Also, troops knew that the war was winding down. Some refused to go on patrol. They didn't see the point in risking their lives when the war might be over soon. Why die just before the war ends? Lastly, and this is possibly the most shocking one, were the instances of fragging. In 1970, 209 cases of officers who insisted men go on patrols were murdered by their own men. The term fragging relates to the fragmentation grenades that soldiers carried with them. The usual way that this was done is that the officer was isolated and then a fragmentation grenade was chucked in there. The claim would be made that the grenade went off accidentally and therefore the officer had been accidentally killed. Of course, in these 209 cases, it was pretty obvious that this wasn't the case. Well, really, what fragging shows is how low American morale had dropped by the end of the Vietnam War. Now the effects on ARVN. Over half of South Vietnamese men aged 15 to 49 were in ARVN. That's right, 15 to 49. The soldiers in ARVN were typically younger and older than they would have been in the American army. But yet they still didn't have enough men to fight the war. There was poor discipline in ARVN. ARVN officers were reluctant to lead their men. 150,500 desertions took place in 1970. These are people who should have turned up for duty and simply ran away and went off home. Also, corruption was rife. Troop numbers were falsified, supplies were stolen for people's own profit and then sold, and officers were not appointed on their skill level but based upon who they knew and not what they knew. Now let's consider the effects of training and equipment. Troop shortages meant that training was rushed. 75% of ARVN officers or leaders had less than 1 year of experience. Also, US equipment had instructions in English. Few ARVN soldiers could read them. It's all very well providing a man with an M16 rifle, but if you don't teach him how to look after it, the chances are the moment you point it at a Viet Cong fighter and pull the trigger, it's going to go click. And that will not help you at all. Lastly, the economic and political problems in South Vietnam. As US troops pulled out, 300,000 Vietnamese who relied on American money lost their jobs. Without American support, the puppet South Vietnamese government fell. And despite efforts to improve it, ARVN could not win on its own. Once you've produced a diagram of this type on your own, you might want to consider which had the biggest effect. Was the biggest effect on the biggest failure of Vietnamization the effects on the US Army? Or was the biggest effect of Vietnamization's failure on ARVN? Or was it on training and equipment? Or was it the economic and political problems that it led to in South Vietnam? There's no particular wrong answer to this, but do try and back it up with some analysis and explanation of your own. Once you're happy with this information, just move on. Let's look at the process of leaving Vietnam and the very end of the war. In 1973, US involvement in Vietnam all but ended. On the 27th of January 1973, the Paris Agreement was signed. This was a peace treaty signed in Paris, hence its name. This set up a ceasefire between the USA, North Vietnam, the Viet Cong and South Vietnam. In effect, this ended the war. However, all was not as it seemed. While ARVN had been improving its own forces and getting reinforcements, the North had been doing the same, being constantly resupplied and trained with new equipment by both the Chinese and by the Russians. They had also been planning an all-out invasion of South Vietnam. In March 1975, they were ready to launch this invasion. The North Vietnamese army launched a full-scale invasion of South Vietnam and one that they were very likely to win. Just over a month later, on the 30th of April 1975, Saigon fell. Think about how quickly Saigon fell. This war had been dragging on for decades by this point, and yet in its last action it was over in less than 2 months. The last US advisors and troops were evacuated in a last-minute and humiliating scramble. This was not Nixon's honourable withdrawal that he had intended upon with Vietnamization. As an example of this, have a look at the photograph on the right. This shows an American Huey helicopter landing on top of the American embassy. By this point, most US officials would have already been evacuated, but those people scrambling up there would have been South Vietnamese people who were sympathetic to the American effort and would have been fearful of falling into the clutches of the communists. A Huey helicopter like that, even when it was massively overloaded, would only hold about 15 people, and clearly not everyone was going to get aboard it. I've also included in the description a link to a video of a news report that shows the scramble of the fall of Saigon. Particularly telling is the fact that many helicopters were simply pushed into the sea once they had run out of fuel. There was no more room on the decks of American aircraft carriers to take more helicopters, and so these valuable pieces of equipment were simply shoved into the sea. Lastly, and this must be appreciated, the North had won. After all of those years of fighting domino theory, of fighting to prevent the fall of Saigon, of fighting to prevent the spread of communism in Asia, the North had won, Vietnam had been reunited, and it had now been made communist. Arguably, all of that fighting from the US point of view had been for very little, and that was a bitter pill to swallow, especially with all those that had died. Some brief tasks then. Record these events, and then, do you think the North winning was inevitable by this point? Was it always going to happen? Relate this to the failures of Vietnamization. Relate this to the fact that the USA had by this point withdrawn, and relate this to the continued strength and the continued improvement of the fighting techniques of the North Vietnamese army. Pause the video while you complete those tasks, and then press play when you're ready to continue. Finally, did Vietnamization work? Well, I think you've probably got an idea about that by now. Let's look at these statistics. In 1970, $18,536 million was spent on the war. While this is still a colossal amount of money, it's a substantial reduction on earlier years. 334,600 troops were in Vietnam, but this is about 200,000 less than there had been 2 years earlier. And there were 6,173 combat deaths in Vietnam for US forces in 1970. A horrendous number, but again lower than it had been. By 1972, $8,662 million was spent, a further reduction. Troop numbers have been drastically reduced to 24,200 troops, many of these in second line or training occupations. And although 759 dead is still tragic, it's a further reduction. Lastly, let's consider how these statistics might support the idea that Vietnamization worked. Then, explain using your own knowledge why you know that in many ways Vietnamization failed. Use other points raised in this video or other parts of your own learning on the topic. Pause the video now and consider those statistics. Well, it's time to finish, but let's just have one last look at the statistics. By 1975, $1,530 million had been spent. 161 troops were left in Vietnam, most of them defending the US embassy in Saigon, and 62 were killed. Clearly, the US involvement in Vietnam had massively wound down by this point, but over 50,000 Americans had been killed in the over 10 years that America had been involved. A tragic loss, and what did they have to show for it? Arguably, very little in terms of the reasons that they went in there. But that's the end of the Vietnam War. And that's also the end of this video. So, if you enjoyed that, if you found it useful, please find the time to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and comment if you have any suggestions. Many thanks for watching, and goodbye.